When did you last check your phone for a message that you already knew was not coming? Not a message you were unsure about. One you had already, quietly and correctly, predicted would not arrive. And still you checked. You have done this before. Maybe an hour ago. Maybe last night, lying in the dark, thumb moving before thought had time to intervene. The person on the other end of that silence does not want what you want. You have known this for a while now, in the part of your mind that keeps ledgers, that does the arithmetic no one asked it to do. And yet the wanting continues, completely undisturbed by the knowing. This is the gap, not the gap between you and them. The gap between what you know and what you do. You know the outcome. You act as if you don't. Most people call this hope, or bad luck, or chemistry. Tonight you are going to learn what it actually is, according to the one thinker who mapped it with more precision than anyone before or since. And once you see the mechanism clearly, you will not be able to unsee it operating in your own life. This gap is not neutral. It is doing something to you, quietly, every single day that it stays open. There is one figure in the history of psychology who described this exact terrain better than anyone else, the American philosopher and psychologist William James. Not Freud, not Jung, James, writing in the final decade of the 19th century, in two texts that were never meant to be read together, but that, side by side, explain almost everything about why you keep wanting someone who does not want you back. The first is his enormous study, The Principles of Psychology, published in 1890. The second is a shorter essay called The Will to Believe, from 1896. James built his entire account of belief and desire around a single unit he called the option a live possibility the mind refuses to let go of. In his own words, describing what makes a possibility feel alive to a person rather than dead to them. As opposed to merely appealing in the abstract, the maximum of liveness in an hypothesis means willingness to act irrevocably. Read that twice. Liveness, for James, was never about how much you feel. It was about whether you are willing to act completely, without a safety net. And out of that idea, James built a quieter, more dangerous concept of possibility kept alive in the mind, without ever being allowed to resolve into action. This video is going to show you the mechanism James discovered, how a person who does not want you gets suspended in your mind as a live option, long after every available fact has already told you the option is dead. Here is how suspension actually works, according to James's own model of the will. In The Principles of Psychology, James argues that an idea, left alone in the mind, tends to discharge itself into action almost automatically. He called this ideomotor action. Think a movement clearly enough, and the body tends to perform it, unless something interferes. What interferes is a second, competing idea occupying the mind at the same time. A doubt, a memory, a piece of evidence that contradicts the first idea. When two incompatible ideas hold the mind at once, James observed, neither one discharges. Nothing happens. The person is not choosing. The person is being held, suspended between two ideas of unequal weight, doing the work of neither. Apply this to the person who does not want you. One idea in your mind says, plainly they do not want this. Stop. This idea is fully formed. You could act on it today, this hour, with no further information required. Standing opposite it is another idea, almost always smaller and weaker, a memory of one good night, one warm message, one moment that felt like proof of something more. That second idea has a fraction of the evidence behind it, and yet it is enough to hold the first idea in place indefinitely. Neither discharges, you do not walk away, and you do not pursue them fully either. You are suspended between two ideas of unequal weight, and over time the suspension itself starts to feel like devotion, when it is actually paralysis wearing devotion's clothes. James drew a distinction between what he called wish and will. A wish is an idea you hold without ever letting it discharge into behavior. A will is the same idea permitted to complete itself in action. Suspension, in this light, is a person trapped in a permanent condition of wish, mistaking the intensity of the wishing for the presence of a will that was never actually engaged. Every time you check their profile, reread an old exchange, or rehearse the conversation you never had, you are not moving toward resolution. You are recharging the same idea, spending psychic energy to keep an option alive that your own evidence has already killed. This is what people mean, without knowing the underlying mechanism, when they say someone will not let go. Letting go, in James's terms, was never a feeling you wait to arrive. It is an act of discharge the moment an idea is finally permitted to resolve into behavior and stop circulating. Audit your own history for a moment. Think of the version of you from a year ago, or 5 years ago, who wanted someone who did not want them back. Somewhere in that period there was a piece of evidence, a message, a silence, a plainly stated fact that should have discharged the idea completely, and did not. You absorbed the evidence and kept the idea alive anyway, because discharge was never really about the evidence. It was about whether you were willing to act on what you already knew to be true. Notice, too, what suspension does to the ordinary texture of your days. James believed that attention itself takes effort, that holding an idea steadily in the mind is not a passive event, but an active expenditure. A suspended option is expensive precisely because it demands this kind of attention on a loop, without ever letting the loop close. You are not simply thinking about this person from time to time. You are performing small, repeated acts of attention that keep the idea charged, checking, replaying, imagining a version of events that has not happened, and, on the evidence available to you, is not going to happen. None of this feels like effort while you are doing it. It feels like feeling, but James would have called it exactly what it is. Unresolved will, dressed up as emotion, running in the background at a cost you are not billed for until much later. The test is simple. Is there any piece of information that would actually make you act differently? If the honest answer is no, if no new fact, no clearer signal, no further proof would change what you do next, then you are not waiting for information. You are simply suspended, and the waiting has become the point. The mind does not experience suspension as paralysis. It experiences it as patience, as loyalty, as being the kind of person who does not give up on people. This is the false belief that keeps the option alive long after it should be dead. The idea that waiting is itself a form of wisdom, rather than a form of avoidance wearing wisdom's clothing. It shows up as a small set of private stories you tell yourself, always slightly different, always doing the same job, that the timing is simply off, that they are going through something right now, and it will pass, that if you were a little different, a little more patient, a little less visible in your wanting, the outcome would shift. None of these stories are examined. They do not need to be. Their entire function is to buy the option one more day of life. James's second text, The Will to Believe, gives you the tool to see through this. He built his argument around what he called a living option, a possibility, where both sides, acting and not acting, still feel genuinely open to the person holding it. A living option only stays alive as long as you keep it alive. It does not survive on its own evidence. It survives entirely on your continued willingness to entertain it. And James was direct about something most people never confront. Refusing to decide is not the same thing as staying neutral. Telling yourself you will decide later, that you are simply keeping your options open, that you just need a little more time that itself is already a decision. It commits you to the present arrangement exactly as firmly as walking away would, except without ever having to be named, defended, or examined by you. This is the precise structure of the false belief. It never has to be proven wrong. It only ever has to ask you for a little more time. And because it is never tested against reality, because no deadline is ever set, no threshold ever named, it cannot fail in any way you would notice. It simply continues, indefinitely, at your expense. Now confront your own evidence directly. There was a version of this exact belief operating in you before, with this person or with someone before them, and it failed. Not dramatically. Quietly, you waited. Nothing changed. You told yourself something would shift if you were patient enough, understanding enough, present enough. It did not shift. The belief was never actually tested by you. It was simply extended, month after month, on credit it never had to repay. That is not wisdom. James would call it a living option you refused to let die, kept alive purely by your own willingness to keep reopening the question, rather than by any new fact that ever arrived to justify it. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Because here is what almost no one tells you about suspension. It does not only cost you time, it costs you something considerably harder to replace. Run the ledger honestly, the way James would have insisted on running it. There is a cost to acting, to naming the truth out loud, ending the pursuit, closing the option for good. That cost is real. It is grief, awkwardness, the death of a specific imagined future you had been quietly rehearsing for months. Most people overestimate this cost badly, because it is vivid, immediate, and arrives all at once, in a single identifiable moment they can dread in advance. There is also a cost to suspension, to keeping the option technically alive indefinitely, and this cost is almost never counted because it never arrives all at once. It is paid in small installments you barely register. The hour spent rereading old messages instead of building something new. The attention diverted away from people who might actually want you. The version of yourself that grows quieter and more guarded with each cycle of hope, followed by disappointment. Suspension feels cheaper than action, precisely because its price is distributed so widely across time that no single payment ever seems large enough to object to. But add up every installment, and you were never preserving yourself by waiting. You were spending yourself, a little at a time, on an option your own evidence had already closed months ago. There is a particular kind of person this ledger tends to catch, and it is worth naming plainly. It is rarely the person who has never been chosen. It is far more often the person who has been chosen before, who knows exactly what wanting fulfilled feels like, and who has therefore convinced themselves that the current suspension is a temporary exception rather than the pattern itself. That prior evidence of having been wanted becomes, perversely, the very thing that funds the suspension proof in your mind that you are simply waiting for a repeat of something real, rather than manufacturing hope out of a situation that has already told you what it is. James understood something about this particular kind of spending that most people miss entirely. He distinguished between what might be called intellectual difficulty and volitional difficulty. Intellectual difficulty is the difficulty of knowing what is true. For you, that part is already finished. You know they do not want you. You have known for a while. Volitional difficulty is something else entirely. It is the felt weight of actually doing something about what you know. And it does not shrink no matter how clearly you understand your situation. This is why a person can recite the correct conclusion about their own life with total fluency and still not move an inch. Understanding was never the missing ingredient here. James illustrated this gap between resolve and action with an ordinary image A person lying in bed on a freezing morning, certain they should get up, and unable to. The resolve keeps rising toward the decisive act, and then, in his own words, it faints away and postpones itself again and again. Not because the person does not know what to do, because knowing and doing draw on entirely different reserves inside the same mind. You have been treating your situation as an intellectual problem, something that will resolve itself once you finally understand it clearly enough. It will not. You already understand it completely. What has been missing was never clarity. It has been the volitional act itself, and here is why more time only makes this worse, never better. Every day you leave the option open, the imagined cost of finally closing it grows larger, because the story you have built around it, the version where it still might work, has had another day to gather detail, memory, and hope. Waiting does not make the eventual act easier. It makes the accumulated thing you would be walking away from larger, heavier, harder to set down. This is why people who wait 5 years to leave something they should have left in 5 months rarely describe the eventual act as easier for having waited. They describe it as unbearable, precisely because time was never on their side. It was working against them the entire time, disguised as safety. So here is the exit, and it will not be comfortable, and James would not have made it comfortable for you either. You are not going to feel ready before you act. Readiness was never coming. Because readiness is fundamentally an intellectual state, and your problem here was never intellectual. You are going to act imperfectly, without the clarity you have been demanding as a precondition for months or years, and the clarity, if it comes at all, will arrive afterward, as a consequence of the act, not as its cause. Discharge the idea. Let the option close, finally, on purpose. Not because you suddenly feel certain, but because the certainty was never going to arrive first. Clarity doesn't come before action. Action produces clarity. The next part looks at why the people who don't want you are so often the ones you cannot stop thinking about, and what that pattern, according to this same mechanism, actually reveals about you.